Mount Casalluccio, Sicily. Before dawn, July 11, 1943. Lieutenant Colonel Dante Ugo Leonardi crouches in a shell crater on a bare hilltop above the Gela Plain, waiting for an artillery barrage that is already 40 minutes late. Below him, in the flat, reaped cornfields between his position and the sea, 1,100 Italian infantrymen of his 3rd Battalion, 34th Infantry Regiment, are lying in the open, waiting for the order to attack a beachhead most of them cannot even see. 4 years later, in a slim, largely forgotten memoir titled Luglio 1943 in Sicilia, July 1943 in Sicily, Leonardi would set down, in plain and unadorned prose, exactly what it felt like to command men into that kind of fire without knowing what waited on the other side of it. Of the moment the guns still hadn't opened up and the attack order had already been given, he wrote only this, that under such circumstances all a soldier could do was trust in the goodness of God. This is not the version of Sicily you get from the American war films. This is not a story about beaches and liberation parades. It is the story, told largely in an Italian officer's own words, of what it looked like from the other side of the guns when a green, undertrained Italian division walked into the most experienced amphibious raiding force the United States Army had yet produced, and of what that officer thought, decades later, about the men who cut his battalion to pieces in a single morning. Accounts differ on some of the finer details of troop movements that night. Leonardi himself admits the fog of confused orders and unfamiliar terrain in his own account, but the shape of what happened at Gela on July 11, 1943 is not in serious dispute. It is recorded in Leonardi's memoir, in the U.S. Army's own official history, and in the war diaries of the Livorno Division itself. Leonardi was not a reservist handed a battalion because there was no one else available. He commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 34th Infantry Regiment, part of the Livorno Division, by a wide margin the best equipped and best led Italian division stationed in Sicily in the summer of 1943. Where most Italian formations on the island were static coastal units, poorly armed and poorly motivated, the Livorno Division was nearly fully motorized, a rarity in the wartime Italian army, and had been specifically selected and trained the previous year for an amphibious and airborne assault on Malta. An operation that never happened, but that had given the division's officer corps a standard of preparation well above the Sicilian average. Morale, by Leonardi's own account, was relatively high, and the quality of leadership among his fellow officers was good. What the Livorno Division did not have was combat experience. Its troops, Leonardi wrote plainly, were green, they had never been tested in action. When the invasion order reached his battalion's quarters at midnight on July 10, 1943, it was, for every soldier under his command, the first hour of the first battle any of them had ever fought. The men waiting for Leonardi's battalion on the other side of the cornfield belonged to an American unit that, by the standards of 1943, was already unusually blooded. The 1st Ranger Battalion had been activated barely 13 months earlier, on June 19, 1942, at Sunderland's camp in Carrickfergus, Northern Ireland, the idea of Colonel Lucian Truscott, who had proposed to General George Marshall that the U.S. Army field a unit modeled directly on the British commandos, then raiding the coast of occupied Europe. Of some 1,500 American volunteers who stepped forward, only about 600 were selected. Their commander was a 31-year-old West Point artillery officer from Arkansas named William Orlando Darby. Darby marched his men to Achnacarry Castle in the Scottish Highlands, where British commando instructors ran them through a training regime built to break unprepared men before the enemy ever got the chance. Darby himself, describing what the commandos put his rangers through, said afterward that the British had done everything in their power to find out what sort of men they were, and then, having apparently liked what they found, had done everything in their power to prepare them for battle. That preparation was tested for the first time in November 1942 during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, when Darby personally led the assault at Arzew, Algeria, an action that earned him the Distinguished Service Cross and the beginning of a reputation, among the men who served under him, that Darby's Rangers went wherever the fighting was worst. By the time the 1st and 4th Ranger Battalions, organized together as Force X, waited ashore at Gela in the darkness before dawn on July 10, 1943, they had already been raiders and shock troops for 8 months of war. Leonardi's Livorno Battalion had been soldiers for less than 8 hours. The Allied invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, began on the night of July 9 and 10, 1943. Force X went ashore at Gela in the pre-dawn darkness of July 10, fighting through a mined beach to seize the town and its coastal batteries, while further east and west, the U.S. 1st and 45th Infantry Divisions and the British 8th Army came ashore along a broad front. Italian coastal defenses, thin and poorly equipped, gave way almost immediately. But 6th Army headquarters under General Alfredo Gazzoni still had one substantial mobile reserve on the island, the Livorno Division, and Gazzoni ordered it, together with the German Hermann Göring Division, to counterattack the beachhead before the Americans could consolidate it. Leonardi's battalion, set off by truck at 7 that evening, was strafed once by Allied aircraft, along the way 2 dead, 20 wounded, in what Leonardi called the battalion's baptism of fire, and reached its jump-off position behind Mount Casalluccio after midnight, with almost no reliable information about where the American lines actually were. The attack order, when it finally arrived, gave Leonardi's battalion the least glamorous role of the three-pronged Italian counterattack, a supporting, pinning action in the center, while the main weight fell to columns on his left and right. At 6:30 on the morning of July 11, after a 30-minute delay because the supporting artillery group had not yet reached its firing position, Leonardi's 1,100 men rose out of their positions and advanced, on open, harvested cornfield, toward a line of low hills held by dug-in American infantry. American mortar and small arms fire opened almost immediately. Leonardi's own account records the first casualties within minutes, his 9th Company commander wounded twice in the opening exchange, a shell fragment killing a soldier 30 meters from Leonardi's own position. Despite the losses, his battalion reached its first objective by 8 that morning, pushing back a thinly held forward American line. It was briefly a success. It was also, though none of them could have known it yet, the easy part of the day. 500 meters beyond that first line sat a second, far more solidly organized American position, the defense line held by Darby's Rangers. Here, Leonardi's battalion walked into a wall of fire that combined American field artillery, mortars, and decisively naval gunfire called in from cruisers and destroyers lying offshore. It took the Italian companies 3 hours to cross those 500 meters. Leonardi later praised, without irony, the discipline of the Ranger position his men were trying to break, and condemned in the same passage the panic of his own inexperienced troops, who instead of dispersing under the bombardment instinctively bunched together for the comfort of each other's presence, and paid for that instinct in bodies. A battalion history rarely survives in the names of its privates. It survives, if it survives at all, in the names of the sergeants and lieutenants who happened to be standing closest to the moment someone thought worth writing down. Leonardi's memoir preserves several of them. Sergeant Quintino Ghioni of the battalion's 9th Company was wounded twice in the assault on an American automatic weapons position and kept leading his squad forward anyway until he was killed seizing it. Lieutenant Latorre took a handful of riflemen and grenades against a small stone house where 8 American infantrymen with 2 machine guns were slowing the entire advance and forced their surrender. And when an American machine gun found the range of Leonardi's own battalion headquarters, pinning the command group in a shallow ditch with no way to move, it was Sergeant Ernesto Benassi who climbed into a nearby foxhole with a Breda light machine gun and simply outlasted it, a duel that by every reasonable expectation he should have lost and did not. On the American side, the Rangers paid their own price for the ground they held. Lieutenant Walter Wojcik, who had distinguished himself weeks earlier in the fighting for Jebel El Ankh Pass in Tunisia, was killed crossing the invasion beach at Jela before the battle for the town had properly begun. A reminder, if one is needed, that the men holding the line Leonardi's battalion could not break were themselves paying in blood for every hour they held it. The battle's single most vivid individual moment, though, belongs to neither side's infantry but to Darby himself. As Italian tanks pushed into the streets of Jela that same morning in a separate, coordinated prong of the counterattack, a young Italian tank officer, identified in post-war accounts as Sub-Lieutenant Navari, found himself alone after his driver was killed restarting a stalled engine by handcrank under fire. Navari pushed his tank to within 300 meters of the beach before the engine failed a second time. He climbed out of the hatch, wounded, pistol in hand. Darby, who had commandeered a captured 37 anti-tank gun and driven it into the town personally to help stop the armored column, shot him before he could raise it. Accounts differ on exactly which detail belongs to which telling. Italian and American sources describe the tank's final stop slightly differently, but that Darby personally killed the last Italian tank commander to reach the beach at Jela is recorded on both sides of the fight. By late morning, Leonardi's battalion had reached the American line, pushed the defenders back from it, and could see 4 kilometers south across open ground the town of Jela itself, and beyond it a sea crowded with what he described as a majestic, overwhelming mass of Allied shipping. It was the high water mark of the attack, and it lasted only a matter of hours. The renewed advance toward the Jela roadblock brought Leonardi's exhausted companies under American naval gunfire, a form of bombardment that, in Leonardi's own words, beat the battlefield like a carpet, a weight of fire no infantry in the world, in his estimation, could have endured indefinitely. His artillery support commander, Major Artigiani, was killed in the barrage. By early afternoon, the promised infantry reinforcements had not arrived, only a single mortar company, a substitution Leonardi called a bitter disappointment his exhausted men could scarcely believe. That night, ordered to withdraw and hold Mount Casalluccio instead, Leonardi's rearguard came under attack from American reconnaissance patrols probing in the darkness. And it was here, in a passage almost startling in its professional candor, that Leonardi paid the Americans what may be the most genuine compliment in his entire memoir. He wrote of the fine and effective quality of American night fighting training, contrasting it directly with what he called the sad and near-total inferiority of ordinary Italian infantry in night combat, a skill his own army had never seriously trained for and had treated institutionally as an exceptional circumstance rather than a fundamental discipline of war. By dawn on July 12, what remained of the battalion, barely 400 of its original 1,100 men, was overrun on Mount Casalluccio after a final American bombardment and infantry assault. Leonardi's own tally, recorded without embellishment in his memoir, put his losses at 70% of the battalion's starting strength dead, missing, or seriously wounded in barely 24 hours of combat. What Leonardi never quite managed in his own post-war account was a single tidy explanation for why it had gone the way it did, and that refusal to oversimplify is in its own way the most useful thing his memoir offers. He does not blame cowardice. His men, by every account including the American one, closed to hand-to-hand range more than once. He blames instead a list of specific and unglamorous failures. A regiment split into pieces and thrown at 3 separate objectives with no radio contact between them. An artillery group that arrived at its firing position half an hour late, night combat doctrine that simply did not exist in the Italian army's training manuals, and troops who, under fire for the first time in their lives, instinctively did the one thing a green soldier should never do under artillery fire: bunch together. Set against that list, one thing stands out by simple contrast. Darby's battalion had already been shaped by 8 months of raiding, night patrols, and hand-picked selection before it ever set foot on the Gela beach. The difference between the two forces on the morning of July 11, 1943, was not, on the evidence of Leonardi's own account, a difference in courage. It was a difference in what each army had spent the previous year teaching its soldiers to expect from a battlefield. The single image that survives most vividly from the fighting around Gela on July 11 has nothing to do with tactics. American naval gunfire, chiefly from the cruiser USS Savannah, caught a battalion of Livorno infantry advancing in the open on the western approach to the town, close-packed in what Ranger observers on the ground described as an almost parade ground formation. More than half the Italian soldiers in that advance were killed or wounded in minutes. Survivors later recalled human bodies left hanging in the branches of the few trees scattered across that stretch of ground, a detail confirmed independently in both American after-action accounts and in the diaries of Ranger officers who walked the field afterward and took some 400 dazed prisoners out of what remained of the shattered formation. It was not Leonardi's own company in that particular field, but it was his division, his regiment, his war, and it is the moment, more than any other from those 2 days, that came to define what the survivors of the Livorno division carried out of Sicily. The memory of walking, in good order and with real courage, directly into a volume of American firepower that no amount of Italian discipline could have absorbed. Leonardi survived Gela. He survived, so far as the surviving record shows, the rest of the war. In 1947, 4 years after his battalion ceased to exist as an effective fighting force in a single morning outside a Sicilian beach town, he published Luglio 1943 in Sicilia, a short, largely unadorned account that made no claims to literary greatness and received, by most measures, very little attention even in Italy. It has been, in the words of one historian who later rediscovered it, all but forgotten, a modest book about an unfashionable defeat, written by a man with no interest in making that defeat sound like anything other than what it was. What Leonardi himself thought, in the decades between 1943 and whatever year he eventually died, about the Americans who broke his battalion in a single morning, the surviving record does not fully tell us. What we do have is the book itself, a document that praises the Rangers' fighting position without flattery, condemns his own army's failures without excuse, and closes its account of the worst day of Leonardi's military life not with bitterness, but with an almost clerical precision about exactly how many of his men did not come home from Mount Casalluccio. William Darby did not survive the war he had spent Gela winning. He was killed by a German artillery burst in northern Italy in April 1945, 9 days before that theater's fighting ended. A colonel, by then a brigadier general, still leading from the front, the way he had at Arzew and at Gela and everywhere in between. Leonardi's men were not cowards, they were not fools. They were, on the morning of July 11, 1943, simply green soldiers on their first day of combat, thrown against men who had already survived Arzew, already survived Tunisia, already spent a year learning exactly the kind of war they were about to fight again in a Sicilian cornfield. It was not courage that decided Gela. Both sides had courage in abundance, and both sides buried their dead to prove it. It was preparation that decided Gela, the quiet, unglamorous, unphotographed difference between a battalion trained for 8 hours and a battalion trained for a year, between soldiers meeting artillery fire for the first time and soldiers who had already learned, the hard way in North Africa, exactly how to survive it. Dante Ugo Leonardi wrote his account not to excuse his battalion's defeat and not to flatter the men who inflicted it. He wrote it, as far as anyone can now tell, simply to put down what he had seen plainly, honestly, and without the comfort of a lie. That in the end may be the most enduring thing to come out of the fighting at Jela. Not a myth on either side, but one tired colonel's insistence, 4 years and one forgotten book later, on telling it exactly the way it happened.